Zahid Anwar is a scholar in the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth and an associate professor of cybersecurity in the Department of Computer Science at North Dakota State University. His research focuses on cybersecurity policy and innovative cyber defense. He has authored over 80 publications in peer-reviewed conferences and journals. He is a CompTIA certified penetration tester, network vulnerability assessment professional, Security Plus professional, and an AWS certified cloud solutions architect. Prior to working in academia, Dr. Anwar was a software engineer and researcher at IBM, TJ Watson, Intel, Motorola, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, XFlow Research, and CERN. In 2015, he received Science of Security research recognition from the National Security Agency. Jeremy Straub is a fellow at the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth and an assistant professor of computer science at North Dakota State University. His research focuses on the intersections between technology and policy in both the artificial intelligence and cybersecurity areas. He is the lead inventor on 2 US patents and has published over 50 journal articles and hundreds of conference papers. He is a member of the multiple professional societies, including the American Society for Engineering Education and SPIE. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Security Agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and other sources. He is the Associate Director of the Institute for Cybersecurity Education and Research. So as you can hear from their bios, they have a lot of qualifications, a lot of certifications. A lot of them I don't even know what they are, so I'm very impressed by them, though. They're impressive sounding. And so I'm really excited that they're here to share their knowledge with us today. And you'll have a chance to ask your own questions at the end of their presentation. So without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Zahid Anwar and Dr. Jeremy Straub.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for being here on such a wonderful day. So Dr. Straub and myself, we work in cyber, as John already mentioned, and we look at policy implications with cyber. If you were here at the last talk, Dr. Ahmed Al-Sadi talked about entrepreneurship and how digitization is helping to remove corruption in those circles. And and he talked about some really huge advantages of all the digital technology that's coming out. We see quite a few up here. We've added, so we are seeing smart transportation systems, virtual reality and the metaverse. We're seeing things like smart farming machinery, everything poised to help us improve our quality of life and help us with a more sustainable future. On the other hand, like I said, we do like to study how to make and break these things. And so there are certain evil people out there in the world who might be looking to take advantage of these new technologies that are coming out for their own personal gain.
So one of the things, as we're thinking about cybersecurity is thinking about how this impacts those in the audience, whether it's here in the room or online. And so just wanted to kind of see with a quick show of hands, how many people have received a data breach notification in here? A few, most, sorry, a lot of hands are going up. For those that can't see us online, that was almost everybody. How about how many people have had your information misused by somebody else? Again, not quite as many as the data breach notifications, but a lot of hands. What about a friend or a loved one who's received a data breach notification or had their information misused? So again, almost everybody, not quite as many as people that have received a data breach notification themselves. But again, so we're talking about stuff that's obviously relatively pertinent. And as we get into this too, we want to really involve those that are in the room in this discussion, and try to talk about kind of how some of the stuff we're talking about on the screen up here is actually impactful to people every day, whether in their everyday lives, in their work, et cetera. So that's going to be something we're going to come back to.
Okay. So here's a picture of what we've seen last year. We are seeing in 2022, there were a 70% increase in the number of individuals impacted due to a data breach that everyone's very familiar with. And we are seeing huge companies. You can see I have we have Meta up there, Twitter, Uber, T-Mobile, millions and millions of users. So clearly, hackers now have the intellectual capability, they have the access to those fast delivery networks to try and infiltrate and successfully infiltrate your networks 24/7. Really, purse snatching or car theft is not so easy as compared to data theft nowadays, right? And this is all because of automation, right? So digitization, automation. So are hackers using this kind of automation to their advantage?
And so we come back to, again, some questions. Let's think about how this relates to us. So one of the things we want to think about here, again, we're trying to tie this back to law and policy. That's our big focus. How many people know about a law that prevents somebody, that's supposed to punish somebody or supposed to prevent somebody from accessing your computer or somebody else's computer? Is anybody that's familiar with a law that does that? Okay, nobody. All right, that's concerning. What about, I mean, how about just thinking about whether we have laws that do, maybe you don't know a specific law. Do most people think that we have a law that's supposed to prevent access from a few? Does anybody have an idea as to what it's supposed to prevent? Because I mean, you have to follow these things, right? Yeah.
Yes. How does law prevent access? The law really tells you don't be a bad boy or girl, but it doesn't stop somebody from being a bad boy or girl.
So let me repeat that for those online. The question was, so how does the law prevent access, right? It tells people not to, but it doesn't, it's not like the law is going to jump up and, and tackle them to the ground or something, right? And so I would say it's a deterrence, right? I mean, so if people are concerned about the punishment for the crime, presumably, hopefully they won't commit the crime. But of course, if they're not concerned about the deterrence, if the punishment is not sufficient or the likelihood of being caught is not sufficient, it's possible that people won't see the law as particularly effective. So that's a great point. Is there anybody that has an idea about what you're not allowed to do? I mean, there's a lot of people using a digital device in here right now. What aren't you allowed to do with a digital device? Where do you get in trouble? What?
I'm just about myself.
Okay. Anybody have an idea? Because
Information needs to be legally protected. All information, all accounts, I can even answer.
yeah.
I'm trying to narrow the focus here.
So the question.
Mhm.
So the question was, what is the kind of the comparison in the digital space to somebody overhearing a conversation through a window in your house? And it's tricky, right? Because depending on how somebody overhears that conversation, it could be illegal if they're doing something to actively surveil you in an area where you have an expectation of privacy. If you just happen to be talking really loud and it's going out your window, that's kind of your own fault, right? You're broadcasting. And so I think that's a really good point. What is the equivalent in the digital space? Before I answer that, that's kind of where I was going. I wanted to see if anybody had an answer to, though, what are you not allowed to do? And I think we've kind of almost reached the answer of no, but I want to make sure I didn't miss. Is there anybody that wants to take a shot at that question before we charge on? What are you not allowed to do with computers? All right. So the biggest kind of all-encompassing piece of cybersecurity or computer security legislation is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the CFAA. And the CFAA was written really, really early in computing. And it didn't really understand how people were going to fully use computers at that point. It has very broad language. It basically says that unauthorized use of a computer is a punishable offense. What it doesn't do such a great job of is explain what unauthorized usage means, leaving that, unfortunately, to the courts to interpret, which is where we get into some interesting questions. The second question here, again, we asked about somebody else's computer. What about laws that prevent misuse of people's personal information? Is anybody familiar with a law that prevents misuse of personal information? What law are you thinking of, John? Okay, so FERPA, the Federal Education Records and Privacy Act, which applies to people at educational institutions. That's a great example. Any other examples of laws that protect people's information? Yeah. HIPAA, so the healthcare information, I'm going to miss one of the P's, portability, personal information. So there's another P in that, but Portability Act, and that protects medical information. That's a great example. Any other examples that anybody can think of? So those are two very specific ones, right? Educational information, medical information. There's also more general laws that protect information. And one that you might have heard of, the state of California has had a few different laws. They have different acronyms, but there are several state of California information protection laws that are gaining some notoriety. And then the European Union has got something that's called the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, which is kind of an all-encompassing law that deals with data across any number of different spectrums and how to protect that. So there's a lot of laws out there. And again, whether you know that they exist or not, you're supposed to be following them, right? So if you're using a computing device and you're not sure whether you're authorized to be using that, you, in addition to ethical and other considerations, you also have a consideration of maybe whether you're violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And again, we're going to come back to that in a second, but there's a lot of legislation out there, and it really depends where you are in the world, where you are in the United States. Even some municipalities now, or counties or local governments, have laws that relate to data privacy and data protection. So there's a lot of different regulations.
And I'd like to add to that, that a lot of courts try to use the existing physical laws. Like, for example, if you are, thou shall not access someone's computer, who says that an existing trespassing law can be applied there, right? Or if someone hacks into the traffic lights and turns them all green all at the same time, do laws such as manslaughter, the ones that we are familiar with, apply there? So that brings us to some of the laws that we've just talked about. Here we've tried to put a timeline together of regulations that came about after an incident occurred. Now, do note that these are not obviously all the laws, but we did try to cover some of the major ones. You might be familiar with the Enron scandal back in 2002, and it's a big corporate fraud. Companies such as Enron, Tyco, WorldCom were accused of cooking the books. And if you are an accounting student or you're a finance student, you're probably wondering, okay, I know this law. What does it have to do with cyber? Well, maybe not so well known are some of the provisions in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the SOX Act, which talks about IT audits and how companies should maintain their financial data and how long they should do that, how to maintain the privacy and security of those. So it's a really rich law where IT auditors, cybersecurity experts like to work with. Choice point breach is the big incident that came about. This is a big data broker, huge, right? Probably, I think it was the biggest at the time. If you've worked in the US, you might be, you're probably familiar with background checks. So data brokers primarily do background checks on people, and they have a lot of information about you in terms of your employment history, in your credit. And so Choice Point the way the data brokers work in general is that they have this information, and then they have customers. Customers are companies that are people who want to hire you. They create an account, and then they get access to the person's information. ChoicePoint, however, did not do a good job with screening who their customers were. So instead of a genuine company coming in and asking about your information, identity thieves came in. They created fake accounts, and then they got access to thousands upon thousands of citizens' information. The FBI basically informed ChoicePoint saying, "Hey, your data is being leaked." And then around 2004, somewhat, they sent an email out to California residents saying that their data had been breached. California was the only state at the time that had a data breach law. And then, not surprisingly, about 35 other states followed suit with their own data breach laws. And then, so that now, currently today, every one of the 50 states has a data breach law. There's no central one at the moment, but the states deal with this. And I have here several of the incidents that occurred. So we have TJX companies breach led to the payment card industry data security standard, the PCI DSS, which governs the privacy of your credit card data. The Target data breach, the big store, which led to the California Consumer Privacy Act that Dr. Straub just mentioned. We had the OPM breach, which is attributed to foreign attackers, and
just OPM is the Office of Personnel Management, for those that are not familiar with it. They're a big clearinghouse for data, particularly that relates to security clearances.
And so that led to the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. This was, I do believe, the Obama administration, and I was working for a bank at the time, and they were looking into this, the Data Sharing Act. The idea was that the more the information the victims share with each other, they are better prepared if the attacker were to turn around and use the same technique on another victim. And so we probably all familiar with the Equifax breach. Now we're getting into that time period where most of us would probably be aware of these things, the Capital One breach, and recently we have this whole issue with ransomware attacks. So that led to several other policies being enacted. And like I said, there's just so many of them. 2020, there were 316 bills introduced with the word cyber in them. And this was like a 40% increase over the previous years. So yeah, there's just a lot of legislation to get through and understand.
Which kind of brings us to the next question. Does this seem a little bit confusing? Because that's a lot of laws. Now, some of those are obviously, federal laws, and and again, you didn't go into really foreign laws too. And there's a number of foreign laws out there that come into play. And I won't ask the question the way I was actually planning to originally when I put the slide together, because nobody put their hand up and said that they were aware of our specific cybersecurity legislation. So I'm not going to ask about more specifics drilling down to that question. But where we end up with this is that we have a hodgepodge of laws, right? And what that means is that your actions that you're taking are not governed by a single regulation. They're governed by what's called a resulting set of regulations, which means you take all the regulations that potentially apply to an activity. You then have to figure out which ones have primacy over others if they're in conflict. And then that lets you know what you should be doing or what you're not allowed to do. So, if you're thinking about logging onto a server, just take a few hours, look up a few regulations. Hopefully you don't need to use the internet to do that, because, that would trigger another need to look through all those regulations. And, after a good, 10 to 15 hours of research, you'll probably have no idea whether you can actually do what you want to do or not. And so I would say the answer to that is yes, this probably does seem somewhat confusing. And what we also need to kind of put into the mix that wasn't on the previous slide is other jurisdictions, right? So one of the things that's really interesting about the European legislation I mentioned a few minutes ago, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, is the fact that they are globally applicable, at least in theory. The way GDPR is set up is that they gain their jurisdiction, the applicability of the law based upon the citizenship or residency of the person whose information you're dealing with. So in a lot of cases, historically, if you think about how laws are, right? If you commit a crime here, in this theater here today, you would be answerable, of course, to the laws of the United States. You'd be answerable to the laws of the state of North Dakota. You'd be answerable to the laws of the city of Fargo. You wouldn't necessarily expect to be answerable to the laws of, say, Minnesota. We wouldn't expect the Moorhead police to come over, absent some, spectacular emergency where maybe Fargo has to ask them for help and enforce a law. With GDPR, though, we're talking about a European regulator actually saying, company in Fargo, North Dakota, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. And so if you've noticed those little boxes on the bottom of lots of websites you go to where it's telling you about your privacy rights, and a lot of people click close on those without really looking at it, a lot of those boxes all over the world came from a portion of GDPR, right? So everywhere, all over the world, people are, perhaps not reading those as much as they should and clicking close because of a regulation that was enacted in Europe. And again, that makes it very confusing. Another aspect of this that's kind of confusing is the fact that a lot of these laws, and again, I think you said it was 316 that had the word cyber in them, are not fully tested. What do I mean by that? Well, typically we don't consider a law to be well understood until it's been applied by courts many times, right? So if you're trying to figure out that this activity you're thinking of doing this afternoon, whether it's legal or not, in a lot of cases, you can't just read the law. The law may be understandable, it's great if it is, but you also need to look at how courts have interpreted those laws, how courts have applied those laws to particular circumstances and said, okay, this is legal, this isn't legal, this is a more pronounced or less pronounced offense. And so until each of these laws has been looked at by courts several times, perhaps to see if it conflicts with other laws, perhaps to see if it conflicts with the Constitution, et cetera, we don't really have a good understanding of what the law means, or more correctly, how courts are going to interpret it in the future. We have a concept generally in this country and a lot of other countries of keeping the status quo, which means that once a court of competent jurisdiction has interpreted a law, other courts that are in that same jurisdiction will generally try to interpret the law the same way. Now, there's some caveats to that. But what that means is that once a law has been interpreted a few times and we begin to see a pattern of interpretation, at least within the area of those courts, we should see very similar interpretation in the future. And so again, you have this issue with all of these new laws being created, but we don't know exactly how they're going to be interpreted. We don't know if parts of the laws are going to be seen as unconstitutional or maybe a state law that violates a federal law, et cetera. So we don't really know until they're tested a few times how they're going to be applied, which makes it even more difficult to figure out if you can actually do what you want to do. And if that wasn't confusing enough, the last point is even more confusing, which is we don't necessarily know how courts are going to look at laws application to new technologies. Are courts going to see a law that was designed to, say, prevent shoplifting in a physical store as preventing theft on an e-merchant? One of the challenges of interpreting laws in the case of a criminal law is in a lot of cases, you have to meet every element of a crime, right? If the crime says, you went into the store with an intent to remove something, you actually remove something, and then it requires you to make it to the parking lot, for example, because that's where some lawmaking body thought that would be a point at which, if you intervene before that, the person might be able to say, hey, I didn't actually mean to steal this thing or whatever. If you don't take your purchase from the e-merchant to a parking lot, you're not meeting all the elements of that crime, right? So that law may not apply, even though like 85% of it seems like it should. So we have this other question about how any of these laws may apply to technologies they weren't really designed for. And in a lot of cases, the technologies are moving a lot faster than the lawmaking process itself.
Sorry. Hey, so now let's pick a domain, something that close to home, agriculture. So we know that food and agriculture, one of the Department of Homeland Security's 16 critical infrastructures. We have over 2 million farms, over 900,000 restaurants, plants, and these account for a fifth of our nation's economy. We have a lot of these farms utilizing farm management system, digital technologies, precision agriculture, robotics. Just to give you an example, Tyson Foods, producer of about 20% of US produced chicken, beef, and pork, invested about 500 million in automation after the pandemic. And a lot of these digital technologies have, you know, so a lot of autonomous features built into them. John Deere, well-known name here in North Dakota. They have an office here on campus. They provide autonomous features, safety locks, and these came really handy pretty recently when they've about $5 million worth of farm equipment, and this included tractors, harvesters, other machinery was stolen during the occupation of Ukraine. And the Russians moved this equipment a very long way over to, I do believe, Chechnya, which is under Russian control. Interestingly, John Deere was tracking them all along the way, and they were able to use some of these autonomous features to remotely lock these systems down, pretty much converting them into bricks, useless for the thieves. So really, digital technologies, very useful. On the other hand, though, where you use technology, you'll have someone who wants to misuse that for their own malicious purpose. So Russian hackers in 2020 attacked state farms in the US, shut down production, feed systems for farm animals, and demanded a huge sum of ransom. JBS, huge meat packing company, had to literally shut down their plants when a ransomware attacked, and they paid a huge ransom bribe to the hackers to get control back. AGCO, a company that manufactures tractors, and a name known well enough, just like John Deere, was also suffering a ransomware attack around this time. And the attackers literally went in and did this right after they made a big donation to the Ukraine Relief Fund. And during the time that they were, there was the farming season back here at home. And we have the Farm Bill now that's coming out. It's projected to be over $1.4 trillion and expected to address many of these smart farming technologies. And they are being calls now being made for cybersecurity provisions within those. Okay, I'm sorry, did I miss a slide? Okay. So we did some research on the extent of damage someone could do if they got access to technology on the farms. You may be familiar with the research being done right here at the university with UAVs, drones, that have a number of uses on the farms. So for instance, you can use them to monitor the moisture levels. You can use them to plant seeds. There's just a whole host of things that you can do. What we did was we used an attack data set, about 2.8 million records of attacks, Wi-Fi attacks that could target UAVs. And we were able to figure out that UAVs are extremely, extremely susceptible to attacks. The graph here on the left basically shows that as the UAVs went on their paths going around the farm trying to monitor the devices in the fields, they ran out of energy on the way. So they path one, especially since it was a longer path, they ran out of energy and the UAV had to drop without actually finishing their job.
So as we transition a little bit away from agriculture and start thinking a little bit more about how this affects everybody every day, one of the big questions you might be thinking about, or maybe we'll be thinking about in a second when I ask it to you, is what exactly are you doing if you're trying to break into your own device? Can you actually hack your own device? If we're saying that hacking is unauthorized usage, what does everybody think? Can you hack? Are you actually hacking your own device? Anybody think yes? Show of hands, you can hack your own device. What about no? For those that are saying no, why not?
It's your device.
Okay, it's your device, so, okay.
I'm saying, I just like no, because there are some machines that if you try to hack them, the rules about that you can't. I think like PS3 or 4, there's a big thing about that.
Yeah, and I mean, and it kind of comes into two questions, and I guess the question is kind of ambiguously worded too. Can you hack could be taken as like, could you physically do it? And the other question, again, is can you legally do it? Physically, of course, is a question of mechanisms, right? Do you actually have the skills, capabilities, tools, et cetera, to do it? But can you legally hack your own device is another question. And it brings us back to the second question on the slide here, which is really what defines hacking. And this is an interesting term. And in fact, if you go back far enough, you'll see that the term hacking really wasn't used this way initially. And we actually have uses that are still more sanguine to the original use that we still have right now. So if you've ever heard of like life hacking, for example, that's not breaking into some biological facility and injuring people. That's the notion of making changes to your personal lifestyle, et cetera, to change outcomes based upon it. And that was how the term hacking was originally used. It wasn't referring to people that break into computer systems. It was actually referring to people that actually simply played around with them, that were exploring them. But then over time, as people started breaking into systems more and more, this term became more and more and more associated with these, again, these kind of nefarious activities. And so if we take the modern definition of the term hacking and say this is something with nefarious intent, we get to the next question on the slide, which is the question you kind of answered to begin with. Can you actually hack yourself? Can you take a nefarious action against your own system or your own device? Yeah, go ahead.
So to support this particular thought, if I lock my keys in my car, am I guilty of breaking and entering if I get into my car nefariously?
So, well, I guess it depends on why you're getting into your car nefariously. When you ascribe a motive to yourself, then yeah. But so for those that are listening online, I'll just quickly repeat that, which is the question was if somebody was to lock their keys in their car and then break into their car to get those keys, would they really be breaking and entering? I mean, they're obviously breaking and they are entering, but that's not exactly what the law says, right? And this really is kind of a very interesting question because, if you kick down the door to your own house, in almost every case, that's not going to be a problem. Now, obviously, there are some odd cases, if it's not really your house, if it's, you're renting the house, you might be damaging your landlord's property. If you've been told you're not allowed in the property for whatever reason, maybe the city is, deemed the place to be unsafe. There could be a few exceptions to this, but, probably 99 times out of 100, you can't really commit a crime against yourself. When you start trying to break into your own device, and this comes back to what James was saying a minute ago, though, this changes things because it may be your device, maybe not. It may not be your software. So even though you have bought a device, you probably have also agreed to a licensing agreement that says that you don't really own the software. What you own is a license to use the software in a particular way. And if you violate the terms of that license, we come back to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act here potentially. You may be taking an unauthorized activity to access a system, which may mean that, yes, you can actually hack your own device, meaning that it is a nefarious and potentially punishable activity, even though you think, well, it's my device that belongs to me. The software may not. And in some cases, as we're getting more and more complex agreements surrounding device ownership, you may not actually even be buying a physical device anymore. You may actually be buying a license to possess and use a device, even though you're paying for it once, you're not necessarily paying for a fee to use it in the future. And where we're seeing more and more of this is with automotive features. So you may have heard there have been a few patents recently related to add-on features where you buy a car and your seat happens to have seat warmers, but you can't use them unless you pay for an additional fee to unlock it. It's likely that in that case, unlocking this feature that you haven't paid for, you know, again, with intent to deprive the manufacturer of the vehicle of the, you know, the money that they would have otherwise got if you bought this seat warmer capability, this extra functionality, could be a criminal act. This is completely untested at this point, to the best of my knowledge, but this is kind of some of the things we're going to see in the future. So some really interesting questions coming up. Yeah.
You said earlier, on that conversation, so software on my phone is licensed.
Probably.
They
Yeah.
do an update. A lot of my data or photos disappear. I can now sue them. It
So-
depends on whether they have a "we're not responsible" clause.
So the question was, if the software on your phone is licensed and then they do an update to the software, can you then sue them? Well, I mean, so because the data has been lost. So I think there's a few things here. So, I mean, of course, you can sue anybody, right? All it takes, you pay the court a fee, you fill out the right form. The question is whether you could potentially successfully sue them. And I do think in a lot of cases that could come back to what's in the agreement. And it may not be even your agreement, the license agreement for the software. It might be the agreement with your phone carrier. There's a lot of different things that could kind of play into that. And it makes it a really kind of tricky and interesting question. And again, if you happen to lose data in that way, you know, you would need to hire an attorney and actually have them look at all of these different contracts that you've agreed to, you know, and you even get into like interesting questions about, did you actually agree to this contract, right? Because what they call like shrink wrap agreements, or, you know, these like quick click-through agreements that a lot of people don't read. And, you know, a lot of people realize that people don't read these. They have not always been found to be enforceable. They've also not been found to be completely unenforceable either. So you have a complex legal question when you're talking about whether there may be, you know, liability of some third-party software vendor, carrier, et cetera, for lost data. You know, then you have technical questions like, what if the software update was going really well and then the carrier's network dropped? Or maybe the carrier's network was working really great and you happened to walk into a building where you lost connectivity halfway through. And now you have like questions of like contributory negligence, all kinds of interesting things. So it really is a really interesting scenario, you know, and the fact that there's not a quick answer to this question, I think is kind of illustrative of how complex, you know, the question actually is. So thanks for mentioning that.
But it's my own device, my own watch, my own phone, my own tractor, right? So the security controls that we just talked about that enable John Deere to protect their equipment from falling into foreign hands and being used also restricts farmers from hacking into their own tractors, from doing extensive repairs. And just like with the devices that Dr. Straub just talked about, and cars and others, there's loopholes. There's just like with the insulin pump looping. So you may be familiar with this term, you know, diabetes affects millions of Americans. And around 2014, a couple of hackers who were suffering from type 1 diabetes got together and decided, well, could we actually hack our own diabetes insulin pump, like the insulin pump? And what they wanted essentially was a way to embed a feedback control loop in there. They were just tired of having to manually figure out how much insulin they needed. If they were out for a walk, they needed perhaps more. If they're sleeping, maybe they needed the less. And so the existing devices that were on the market at the time did not allow them to do this. So they decided, okay, maybe we can exploit a security flaws. And so one of these hackers went out and he bought an old insulin pump that was no longer being produced, developed, and but it had a security flaw that allowed him to connect it to a glucose monitoring device that he had under his skin. And then he wrote a piece of code on his phone that automatically monitored his glucose levels and then allowed him to configure how much dosage of insulin he was getting every time. And this became big. He put this on the internet. Folks started using the algorithm. It's called do-it-yourself insulin loop. And it gives you the ability to control your own of course, your glucose levels. Unfortunately, this is not FDA approved because, well, with all drugs, there's a chance that you might end up overdosing, and so, but it's there. It's you've hacked it. iPhone hacking is or it's called jailbreaking, is another one, and so tractors like John Deere had these jailbreaking or hacking tools available online. And this isn't something recent. Like John Deere tractors have had this kind of controls built in for something like 20 years. And so things were good. People were able to make repairs on their own tractors. But then suddenly one day, a hacker from Australia going by the name of the alias of Sick Codes decided to go public with how he had jailbroken his tractor. And he went to DEF CON and he showed how he was able to play one of those 3D shooting games, Doom, on a tractor's display screen. And it's just things exploded. John Deere said, oh, well, is this what people are doing? We really need to up our security controls. The community of farmers was not so happy with the Sick Codes for going public with this. And it actually led to a right to repair movement. Well, the right to repair movement was there already, but it got a lot of incentive at the time. Biden government decided to come up with the legislature in support of this right to repair movement, saying, well, our farmers doing really important stuff, and the manufacturers need to be supportive. Because, these devices, the tractors can cost like huge sums of money. And that once you buy one of those things, you don't want to have a dealer telling you, hey, you can't make any more repairs on this, you need to buy a new one. And so they want to run it till it's finished. So this is an example of where policy did support what the consumers wanted.
And you have to think too, if you don't have the right to repair, what happens if the company goes out of business as well? Because that's another challenge, right? If you can't fix it, then the company goes out of business and then the technology is no longer useful. But we switched to kind of what will I believe be our last kind of area of focus now as we're running out of time, which is artificial intelligence. And so the last kind of big area of question now is, how do you feel about being secured by technology and AI? And so we have a few more questions here for everybody. So who thinks that their computer should be able to tell them what to do? Maybe we have a new federal policy that allows your computer to give you some helpful hints for daily life, but they're more of an edict than a suggestion. Anybody okay with that? I'm not seeing a whole lot of hands. What about our next question here? So if your computer decides that you're not following its helpful hint, again, maybe not so much of a hint and maybe more of an edict, should it be able to actually take an action or prevent you from taking an action? Again, this is designed to help you, right? The government has thought through how you should best live your life, and we have laws that tell you how to do that. So you're for it? Okay.
If I drive a car, well,
Okay.
system is
Okay. So for those online, the example was, what if the system's preventing you from driving your car into a wall? So maybe it's preventing a suicide, or maybe just a bad decision, yeah, or an accidental or whatever. So
maybe I drive.
yeah, so or maybe drunk driving. So we have a specific example there where we would like the car to perhaps intervene for safety. Are there any other examples where we'd be okay with a computing system telling us what to do and then making us do it? Yeah.
There's a ransomware threat that I'm not aware of.
Okay, so preventing you from taking, inadvertently becoming a victim of ransomware. All right. Any other examples? Okay. Okay. So another example is maybe making a pilot follow the recommendation of an autopilot system on a commercial jet if they're not avoiding bad weather. That's another great example. Yeah.
There might be
So I'm not sure how to rephrase that as a question for those on Zoom, but the basic gist of that, which included a quote from Ben Franklin, was that you don't necessarily gain safety by giving up freedom. Did I do that justice, Pat? Okay. And then one more example.
In the medical care. Grateful injection.
Yep. So maybe something where it's providing medical care and we want it to follow the doctor's orders as opposed to the patient's. Okay. Yes, James.
You know the domain of the decision beforehand, and so we can say yes or no, maybe we keep it off at the time, depending on how much scenario. That's very different than having, a general reality that is giving you suggestions that you have to listen to, without how it's saying that I can't just do that.
And so just again, try to paraphrase that for those listening on Zoom. The idea of James's comment was that maybe we have kind of an opt-in saying, hey, we're going to be okay with that medical decision making, or we'd like the car to avoid the wall, but not saying, hey, you can do whatever you want, and becoming 2001: A Space Odyssey's HAL computer that's basically saying, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Just kind of arbitrarily. And of course, this gets tricky, right? Because there's a lot of different movements right now to try to have technology help regulate, or in some cases actually regulate, human behavior through messaging, through turning systems off, making it so persons under a certain age can't access certain content at certain times of the day by just simply not allowing them to do it. We have a lot in autonomous vehicles. There's a new movement of trying to have basically drunk driving prevention systems in every car within the next decade. And you run into a lot of kind of interesting issues when you start talking about that, because maybe these systems do work the way that they're supposed to, maybe even 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100. But that brings us to our last question of, what do you do in an emergency? What if that wall the car thinks you're trying to avoid is actually a wall you need to plow through to escape a flood, right? A piece of information that the car doesn't. The car is seeing a wall, it sees a problem, and you're seeing a tsunami behind you, and you're hoping the car can make it through that wall. How do we deal with the exception? Or are we happy just letting the technology make the decision? And hopefully it's right most of the time. Anybody have a thought on that? Yeah, Pat. Yep. Well, and so the response was that it's fine to give suggestions, but preventing or dictating not so much. Of course, the challenge you get into is that car that that's avoiding that wall, it's not asking you if you would like to avoid the wall. It's hitting the brakes, right? So that would be something where, unless there was an explicit mechanism to override it, you're not going through the wall. So some interesting things to think about, right? But these are, these are not, 2000. Well, I mean, I guess we're past 2001, so they're also not 20 years ago's problems, but they're not problems that are 100 years in the future. We're not thinking like, when we build a starship, we're going to have these problems. These are things we're going to start having in society now, right? We have legislation right now in a number of US states and other countries that's talking specifically about disabling certain types of social media for people of certain ages at certain times of the day. There have been discussions about whether that might be appropriate to do for people that are possibly social media addicts that are not youth. There are a lot of different questions that are arising in this area. Again, the system that perhaps will prevent you from using your car as a breathalyzer, but it might also prevent somebody that is marginally over the legal limit from using the car to seek emergency aid at a hospital. That's a very specific exception. But these are the challenges, again, of the next 5, of the next 10 years, and some of them are the challenges today. So again, some really interesting things to be looking at.
We end here.
I think there's another slide.
Yes, but we are out of time, I think. Okay. Yeah, so you may be familiar with another law, the infrastructure law. And like Dr. Straub just mentioned, we do have a lot of deaths in the US because of drunk driving. Congress has recently mandated as part of this law that cars have these breath analyzers that could automatically check if you are you're impaired, and that they would stop the car from moving if there's something positive. And this could lead to the Peltzman effect. If you were here at Sam Peltzman talk earlier, there are some unintended consequences of legislatures. So, for example, what we saw with the seatbelts legislature many years ago, when the seatbelts mandate came about, people decided, okay, well, I have these seatbelts now to protect me. And so I don't need to be as careful as I used to be. Same thing with COVID-19. When the government came out with guidelines about social distancing, people said, okay, well, now there's these things in place. I can be a lot more, open with how I meet with my loved ones, with other people. And so there could be instances where people misuse this. Oh, the car's going to stop me anyways if I'm, intoxicated. So let's just drive.
And so again, we are running out of time here, so we'll go through these, but I do want to just mention these questions, if nothing else, just the things to think about going forward. What would be the impact if your cell phone didn't work when you needed it? What would what about if electronic assistant service, an Alexa or similar? What about, if your car wasn't available? Because this is what, when we start thinking about cyber attacks as opposed to more generally policy implications, these are questions kind of about the denial of access to services. And again, that's kind of the big question going on. And I think that kind of ties into the transportation systems.
Yeah, the transport. We saw the Colonial Pipeline attack last, I do believe, a couple of years ago, where there was a ransomware attack on a system that managed the oil systems. And this company is big on the East Coast. There was panic buying, long lines at the gas stations, and the company ended up paying a large ransomware ransom to the attackers, and they were able to start the operations after several days. We have other kinds of attacks that can come up as a result of this law. So now, since the government is trying for EV adoption, mass EV adoption, there's, all electric cars by 2020s, I do believe, 2030, sorry, is the mandate. We are seeing people using tools available online for easily available. This person here is stealing an electric vehicle, a Tesla. There's two people there, and he's using something called a relay attack. So there's one person who's shadowing the owner, and he's using the signals from the fob in his pocket, relaying it to the person who's actually going to get into the car and drive it away. And here's some research on, but I think I'll go over, skip this.
The electric car, but what's the point if the car is trapped and disabled? So yes, he was able to break into it.
Sure.
Even if it's not it,
Uh-huh.
I mean, they have access to the full position system, and you can actually turn it on and turn it off remotely.
And what's to say that can't be taken over either? So it's all computers. And so you could disable some of those features, but you're right. So if you have, so there are controls, computer controls that could thwart or save you from other controls in the system that could be compromised. So yeah, that's quite possible.
And at a minimum, they get your stuff in your car, if nothing else.
Yeah. Okay. So did you want to? Or...
Yeah, and so maybe a question really quickly up.
These are stolen car purchased, but then the third car, but they're definitely not the benefit.
And just for those on Zoom really quickly, the question that we didn't actually repeat a second ago was about people breaking into an electronic or electric vehicle that was potentially tracked, and that potentially, a lot of different ways that could come back. So thank you for sharing that. Again, we're basically out of time here. So a few quick questions to kind of leave people with, again, thinking about the impact of all of these different things. What's the impact of computers and technology not working on business? What about companies, customers, and maybe most importantly, in a lot of cases, the company's reputation. You can build back a system failure quite quickly. However, reputation takes far longer to build back in a lot of cases than a single system fix. And so again, this ties into a lot of what we've already talked about, but it's a really kind of key point going forward as well.
Presentation, we learned a lot. It was an excellent presentation. We all learned a lot, and we're out of time, but we'll have time to, I hope that you guys can stick around, and people probably have questions for you out in the reception area. So, so thanks. Let's all give a round of applause.
Thank you.